August 1942, the island of Malta was on the edge of collapse. The once bustling harbour of Valletta stood half-ruined. Streets were cratered, homes buried under rubble, and the great limestone bastions of the Grand Harbour were scarred from 2 years of bombing. The population, 270,000 civilians and a few thousand soldiers, had endured one of the most concentrated air campaigns in history. More than 3,000 raids had pummeled the island since 1940. Every fuel dump has been struck, scattered, and rebuilt in deeper shelters. The dockyard workers emerge each dawn to clear rubble from the same quays they cleared yesterday, knowing that tonight's raids will bring fresh debris. By midsummer 1942, the island is running on fumes. Bread is rationed to 10 ounces per person per day, a slice and a half, weighed to the gram. Cooking oil has vanished from the shops. Soap is a luxury remembered from peacetime. Children play games with empty tins, their contents long since consumed. In the hospitals, doctors operate by candlelight to save the meagre supplies of fuel oil that keep the generators running. The military situation is even more desperate. The fighter squadrons that once rose to meet every raid now husband their aircraft like precious stones. Of the Hurricanes and Spitfires that defended the island through the worst of the Blitz, fewer than a dozen remain serviceable. The rest lie in twisted heaps beside the runways or have been cannibalized for spare parts. Without aviation fuel, even these survivors are grounded. The submarines of the 10th Flotilla, once the terror of Axis convoys crossing to North Africa, sit silent in their pens. Their torpedoes are loaded, their crews ready, but their fuel tanks are nearly empty. The irony is bitter. Malta sits astride the central Mediterranean like a cork in a bottle, perfectly positioned to strangle the supply lines that feed Rommel's Africa Corps. From the island's airfields and harbours, strike aircraft and submarines have sunk hundreds of thousands of tons of Axis shipping. As the Desert War reaches its climax and every gallon of fuel delivered to North Africa could tip the balance, Malta itself is being choked into silence. In the underground war rooms carved into Malta's limestone, staff officers study the same grim reports each morning. Fuel reserves, 12 days at current consumption. Ammunition, enough for one major engagement. Food stocks, 6 weeks if rationing continues. The numbers tick downward with mathematical precision, each day bringing the island closer to a choice between surrender and starvation. The Allies understand what Malta's silence would mean. From their bases in Sicily and Sardinia, German and Italian aircraft have pounded the island not out of spite, but out of strategic necessity. Every bomb that falls on Malta's airfields is a bomb that doesn't need to escort a convoy to Tripoli. Every Spitfire destroyed on the ground is one less threat to the tankers carrying aviation fuel to Rommel's Stokers. If Malta falls, or merely falls quiet, the Mediterranean becomes an Axis lake, and the Desert War tilts decisively toward the enemy. Operation Pedestal is conceived as the answer, a single convoy, the largest and most heavily escorted of the war, carrying what Malta needs most desperately. 14 merchant ships have been assembled in Britain, their holds packed with flour, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and every other necessity of a society under siege. Among them sails a ship whose name will become legend, SS Ohio, an American-built tanker whose cargo of aviation fuel represents nothing less than Malta's ability to fight back. Around these, merchantmen has gathered one of the strongest naval escorts ever assembled for a convoy operation. 2 battleships, HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, provide the backbone of heavy firepower. 3 aircraft carriers, HMS Eagle, HMS Victorious and HMS Indomitable, carry between them nearly 100 fighters and torpedo bombers. 7 cruisers add their anti-aircraft guns and high-speed maneuverability. More than 30 destroyers screen the formation, their crews trained in the deadly art of convoy protection. Their mission is simple to describe and murderous to execute. They must run the Gauntlet from the Clyde to Malta, threading a passage through waters dominated by enemy aircraft, submarines, and fast attack craft. They must fight their way past the airfields of Sardinia and Sicily, through the narrow choke point of the Skirky Channel and along the North African coast where Italian torpedo boats prowl in darkness. If they succeed, Malta lives to fight another day. If they fail, the island's resistance dies with them. On the bastions of Valletta, people scan the empty horizon and clutch their ration books. In the bomb-scarred churches, prayers are offered for ships no one can see, sailing through dangers no one on the island can imagine. In the Admiralty offices of London and Gibraltar, planners study charts of a sea where every mile is contested and every hour brings new threats. The convoy has a code name and a departure schedule. Malta has patience measured in weeks and hope measured in tons. Somewhere between Scotland and the central Mediterranean, these two desperate calculations will meet in battle. Malta's position on the map tells the story of its importance and its agony. The island sits at the narrow waist of the Mediterranean, roughly equidistant from Gibraltar and Alexandria, perfectly placed to dominate the sea lanes between Europe and North Africa. It is close enough to Sicily to be bombed daily, close enough to the North African coast to intercept convoys, and far enough from any friendly port to require extraordinary effort to supply. This geography has made Malta both indispensable and vulnerable. From the island's airfields at Lucca, Halfar and Takali, reconnaissance aircraft can spot enemy convoys forming up in Italian ports. Strike aircraft, Blenheims, Wellingtons and Beauforts, can reach the convoy routes in 2 hours. From the submarine pens at Manuel Island and Lazaretto Creek, British submarines slip out to patrol the shipping lanes, returning with tales of tankers sunk and supply ships sent to the bottom. The statistics of this interdiction campaign are staggering. In the first half of 1941, Malta-based forces sank more than 220,000 tons of Axis shipping. In October 1941 alone, they destroyed 63% of all supplies sent to North Africa. Each sinking reverberates across the desert, where German and Italian tanks run dry of fuel and artillery batteries conserve their ammunition. Rommel himself has called Malta the thorn in our side, and his supply officers curse the island daily as they watch their carefully planned convoys disappear beneath the Mediterranean waves. But Malta's strategic value has made it a target of unprecedented ferocity. Since June 1940, the island has endured more than 3,000 air raids. In April 1942 alone, the worst month of the siege, enemy aircraft dropped 6,700 tons of bombs on an island smaller than the Isle of Wight. The bombing is methodical and relentless, designed not just to destroy military targets, but to break the will of the civilian population and render the island uninhabitable. By August 1942, the siege has entered its most critical phase. The island's reserves are measured not in months, but in weeks. Food stocks have dwindled to the point where the governor, Lord Gort, has warned London that Malta cannot hold out beyond September without massive resupply. The military situation is even more dire. Aviation fuel, the lifeblood of Malta's striking power, is down to a few thousand gallons. Without fuel, the fighters cannot fly, the bombers cannot strike, and the submarines cannot sail. Malta will become what the Germans have always intended, a silent, impotent rock in the middle of their sea. Operation Pedestal's 14 merchantmen carry a carefully calculated cargo of survival. There is flour, 55,000 tons of it, enough to keep the island's population fed through the autumn. There are ammunition and spare parts for the anti-aircraft guns that have kept the Luftwaffe at bay. There are medical supplies for the hospitals that treat both civilian and military casualties around the clock. But above all, there is fuel. The tanker Ohio carries 11,500 tons of aviation spirit, kerosene, and diesel oil, enough to keep Malta's aircraft flying for months. Her cargo represents the difference between resistance and surrender, between a fortress and a tomb. Every gallon in her tanks has been measured against Malta's needs, and the calculation is stark. Without the Ohio's fuel, the island's defences will collapse within weeks. The convoy's escort reflects the operation's desperate importance. The two battleships, Nelson and Rodney, are among the most powerful warships afloat, their 16-inch guns capable of smashing any surface threat. The three carriers bring their own floating airfields, with sea hurricanes and martlets to provide air cover where land-based fighters cannot reach. The cruisers, Manchester, Nigeria, Kenya, and others, add speed and firepower, their dual-purpose guns equally effective against aircraft and surface targets. The destroyer screen is perhaps the most crucial element of all. These ships, Penn, Ledbury, Bramham, and dozens of others, are the workhorses of convoy protection. They hunt submarines, lay smoke screens, rescue survivors, and fight off air attacks with a tenacity born of long experience. Their crews know that in the confined waters of the Mediterranean, a convoy's survival depends not on the big guns of the battleships, but on the vigilance and courage of the destroyers. The threat that awaits them is comprehensive and coordinated. German U-boats and Italian submarines patrol the convoy routes, their positions carefully plotted by enemy intelligence. On the airfields of Sardinia and Sicily, hundreds of aircraft stand ready, Ju-88 bombers, Stokers, SM-79 torpedo bombers, and fighters to escort them. In the harbours of Italy and North Africa, fast attack craft prepare for night actions, their torpedoes loaded and their crews briefed on the convoy's likely course. Yet for all these dangers, the convoy must sail. Malta's needs cannot wait for better weather, clearer seas, or weaker defences. The island's fuel reserves are measured in days, not weeks. Every sunrise that finds the Ohio still in British waters is another day closer to Malta's collapse. The arithmetic of survival allows no delays, no second chances, no margin for error. The assembly of Operation Pedestal began in the grey waters of the Clyde, where merchant ships from across the British Empire gathered like pieces of a vast, desperate puzzle. Each vessel told its own story of wartime improvisation and peacetime purpose bent to military need. The largest was the fast cargo liner Melbourne Star, her passenger accommodations now crammed with ammunition and spare parts. The smallest was the elderly freighter Deucalion, her holds packed with flour and tinned meat. Between them ranged a dozen other merchantmen, each carrying a carefully calculated portion of Malta's salvation. The centerpiece of the convoy was SS Ohio, an American-built tanker that had been requisitioned under Lend-Lease and converted for the most dangerous cargo duty imaginable. Her tanks held 11,500 tons of aviation fuel, high-octane petrol, kerosene, and diesel oil, enough to keep Malta's aircraft flying through the autumn and into the winter. The Ohio was a ship built for peacetime commerce, designed to carry oil safely across calm seas to civilized ports. Now she would carry liquid fire through a gauntlet of bombs and torpedoes, her cargo so volatile that a single hit could turn her into a floating inferno. Captain Dudley Mason, the Ohio's master, understood the mathematics of his mission with painful clarity. His ship was the most valuable target in the convoy and the most vulnerable. Every enemy pilot would aim for the tanker. Every submarine commander would dream of the Ohio in his periscope crosshairs. Mason was a merchant mariner, not a naval officer, but he had volunteered for this voyage knowing that his ship's survival might determine Malta's fate. His crew, a mixture of British merchant seamen and Royal Navy gunners, shared his grim resolve. Around the merchantmen gathered an escort force that represented the cream of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean capabilities. The battleships Nelson and Rodney were veterans of the Atlantic War, their massive guns and thick armour proof against all but the heaviest attacks. Nelson flew the flag of Vice Admiral E.N. Seifert, the operations commander, a man whose experience in convoy battles stretched back to the dark days of 1940. Rodney, slightly older but no less formidable, carried the scars of the battle that had sunk the Bismarck a year earlier. The three aircraft carriers represented different philosophies of naval aviation. HMS Eagle was the oldest, a converted battleship whose flight deck had been added as an afterthought, but whose experienced squadrons had learned their trade in the hard school of Mediterranean operations. HMS Victorious was newer and faster, her armoured deck designed to withstand bomb hits that would cripple lesser ships. HMS Indomitable was the most modern of the three, fresh from the builder's yards and equipped with the latest radar and communications equipment. Between them, the carriers embarked nearly 100 aircraft, Sea Hurricanes, Martlets, Fulmars, and Albacores, each type specialized for different aspects of the coming battle. The fighters would provide air cover over the convoy, their pilots trained to intercept enemy bombers before they could reach their targets. The torpedo bombers would strike back at enemy ships and submarines, carrying the war to the attackers. It was a formidable force, but one that would be tested to its limits in the confined waters ahead. The cruiser force reflected the Royal Navy's wealth of experience in Mediterranean warfare. HMS Nigeria, flying the flag of Rear Admiral H.M. Burrow, was a modern light cruiser whose dual-purpose guns could engage both surface and air targets with equal effectiveness. HMS Manchester was her sister ship, equally fast and well-armed. HMS Kenya and HMS Liverpool added their own firepower to the screen, while the anti-aircraft cruisers HMS Cairo and HMS Charybdis brought specialized weapons designed specifically to deal with air attack. But it was the destroyers that would bear the heaviest burden of convoy protection. More than 30 of these versatile warships formed the convoy's outer screen, their roles as varied as their names were famous. HMS Ledbury and HMS Penn were fleet destroyers, fast enough to keep up with the battleships and heavily armed enough to fight surface actions. HMS Bramham and HMS Bicester were Hunt-class escorts, smaller but nimble, designed specifically for the close-in defense of merchant ships. Each destroyer captain brought his own experience and expertise to the operation. Lieutenant Commander J. H. Swain of HMS Bramham had already made 3 trips to Malta, each time fighting his way through air attacks and submarine ambushes. Commander R. T. White of HMS Ledbury was a specialist in anti-aircraft warfare, his ship's guns credited with shooting down more than a dozen enemy aircraft in previous actions. These men and their crews would provide the convoy's first and last line of defense, their ships expendable, if necessary, to ensure that the merchantmen reached their destination. By August 3, 1942, the loading was complete and the convoy was ready to sail. 14 merchantmen, escorted by some of the finest warships in the Royal Navy, prepared to embark on a voyage that would test every principle of naval warfare and every limit of human endurance. The weather was typical for a Scottish summer: grey skies, intermittent rain, and a persistent wind that whipped the waters of the Clyde into whitecaps. As the ships weighed anchor and formed up in convoy order, their crews took a last look at the Scottish coast. For many, it would be the final glimpse of home. Ahead lay 1,000 miles of increasingly dangerous water, where every mile would be contested and every hour would bring new threats. The convoy had a destination and a mission. What it needed now was the courage to see both through to the end. August 10, 1942, Gibraltar. The great fortress rock loomed against the Spanish coast as Operation Pedestal's convoy slipped through the strait in darkness. The passage was carefully timed to avoid enemy observation. Spanish fishermen and German agents watched the approaches constantly, radioing details of British ship movements to Axis commanders. By dawn, the convoy was well into the Mediterranean, but secrecy was already a lost cause. High-flying reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the formation, and radio intercepts confirmed what German and Italian intelligence had suspected. A major convoy was heading for Malta. The transformation from Atlantic to Mediterranean warfare was immediate and ominous. In the Atlantic, convoys faced the submarine threat primarily, with occasional forays by long-range aircraft. In the Mediterranean, every mile was contested by air, sea, and subsurface forces operating from nearby bases. The sea itself was smaller, shallower, and more confined, offering fewer opportunities for evasion and more chances for concentrated attack. Admiral Seyffert's battle plan reflected these harsh realities. The convoy would proceed eastward at maximum sustainable speed, protected by layers of air cover from the 3 carriers. The battleships would provide heavy gun support against any surface threat, while the cruisers and destroyers maintained anti-aircraft and anti-submarine screens. At a predetermined point south of Sardinia, Bomb Alley, as the crews called it, the heavy escorts would turn back, leaving a smaller force to shepherd the merchantmen through the final approaches to Malta. This withdrawal was perhaps the most controversial aspect of the entire operation. The battleships and fleet carriers represented too great an investment to risk in the narrow waters around Sicily, where enemy aircraft could attack from multiple directions and submarines could lurk in every shadow. Yet their departure would leave the merchantmen with only cruisers and destroyers for protection during the most dangerous part of the voyage. It was a calculated risk that would prove costly. The first enemy contact came at dawn on August 11th as Italian reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoy from a respectful distance. These were the snooper flights that would track the formation throughout the day, radiating position reports to attack forces gathering on Sardinian and Sicilian airfields. The carrier fighters rose to intercept, but the enemy aircraft stayed just out of range, content to observe and report. By mid-morning, the first attacks began. High-level bombers appeared on the radar screens, approaching from the north in loose formations. The carriers launched additional fighters while the escort ships went to action stations, their gun crews scanning the sky for the first sign of enemy aircraft. The attacks, when they came, were probing affairs, small formations testing the convoy's defences and gauging the effectiveness of its air cover. The Sea Hurricanes and Martlets performed well in these early encounters, intercepting most of the attacking aircraft before they could reach their targets. But the enemy was learning too, studying the convoy's defensive patterns and identifying weaknesses that could be exploited in larger attacks. Each reconnaissance flight brought back valuable intelligence about the escort's composition, the merchantman's formation, and the carrier's operating procedures. As the day progressed, the attacks intensified. German Ju-80s joined the Italian bombers, their crews experienced in anti-shipping strikes. The convoy's gunners got their first taste of Mediterranean air warfare as formations of enemy aircraft approached from multiple directions, forcing the defenders to divide their attention and firepower. The sky filled with the black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts and the white contrails of diving fighters. Late in the afternoon of August 11th, disaster struck the convoy's air defences. The carrier HMS Eagle, steaming on the formation's port quarter, came under attack from U-73, a German submarine that had penetrated the destroyer screen undetected. At 13:15 hours, 4 torpedoes struck the carrier in quick succession, their explosions tearing massive holes in her hull. Within minutes, the ship was listing heavily to port, her flight deck canting at an impossible angle. The loss of Eagle was catastrophic in multiple ways. The carrier took with her 16 Sea Hurricanes and Fulmars, reducing the convoy's fighter strength at the moment it was most needed. More than 100 of her crew were lost, despite heroic rescue efforts by the escorting destroyers. The psychological impact was equally severe. If a heavily defended aircraft carrier could be sunk so quickly, what hope did the merchant ships have? The enemy attacks continued throughout the night, with Italian torpedo bombers making low-level runs at the convoy under cover of darkness. The escort ships fired starshell and searchlight illumination, turning the Mediterranean into a bizarre landscape of harsh white light and deep black shadows. The merchantmen maintained their course and speed, their crews acutely aware that any deviation from formation could prove fatal. By dawn on August 12th, the convoy was approaching the most dangerous phase of its voyage. Ahead lay the Skirky Channel, a narrow passage between Sicily and the North African coast, where enemy aircraft could attack from 3 directions simultaneously. Intelligence reports warned of massive airstrikes being prepared on Sicilian airfields, with hundreds of German and Italian aircraft ready to launch coordinated attacks. The carrier HMS Indomitable suffered the next major blow. Stoker dive bombers, approaching out of the sun, scored direct hits on her flight deck with 500-pound bombs. The armoured deck saved the ship from fatal damage, but fires raged through her hangar spaces, and several aircraft were destroyed. Her ability to launch and recover aircraft was severely compromised, further reducing the convoy's air cover at the critical moment. As the convoy entered the Skirky Channel, the tempo of attacks reached a crescendo. Wave after wave of enemy aircraft approached from all directions, high-level bombers, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers coordinating their attacks to overwhelm the defenders. The sky was filled with aircraft, tracer fire, and exploding shells as the greatest air-sea battle of the Mediterranean War unfolded around the struggling convoy. Dusk, August 12th, the Skirky Channel. An Italian submarine, Axum, found her firing position as Force X. The close escort and the merchantman drove east. In a single salvo, she threw torpedoes into a crowded sea. They struck with brutal effect. The anti-aircraft cruiser Cairo was hit and later scuttled. The flagship Nigeria took damage that forced her out of the line. The tanker Ohio was struck and left burning, slowed, and vulnerable. Nearby, another Italian boat, Alaghi, found and damaged the cruiser Kenya. In minutes, the convoy lost much of its inner shield, and its most precious cargo was crippled. Even as the escorts fought to restore order, the night brought a new kind of threat. Fast attack craft, Italian MAS boats, slipped in at speed. In the small hours of August 13th, they torpedoed the cruiser Manchester off the Tunisian coast. She was scuttled by her crew when damage control could do no more. Other torpedo runs slashed at the freighters, forcing the escorts to choose between pursuit and protection. The convoy disintegrated into clusters of ships fighting their own battles in darkness. Dawn brought no respite. The Axis air forces returned with precision and weight. Freighters were singled out and struck. Waimarama blew apart in a towering sheet of flame under bomb attack, her fuel and cargo turning the morning into fire. Deucalion was lost. Almeria Likes and Santa Elisa burned and sank. The sea was suddenly a landscape of smoke columns and oil. The Ohio, listing, holed, shaken, refused to lie down. Her crew fought fires, worked pumps, and kept the engines turning when they could. At times she drifted. At times she moved. Escorts came alongside to pass lines. Each tow broke under strain or enemy fire. A Stuka, mortally hit, crashed into her deck. The bomb it still carried exploded. The tanker sagged amidships. Men were ordered off, then climbed back on. Tugs there were none. Destroyers and minesweepers took the burden. In the midst of attacks, a few freighters, faster or luckier, edged away to the east. They had their own rendezvous with the island. The convoy was no longer a formation. It was a race against destruction measured ship by ship. The sea, the sky, and the charts all belonged to the enemy. Only stubborn movement belonged to the convoy. The Ohio became the battle's center not because she sought it, but because everything depended on her cargo. With her back cracked, engines failing, and decks torn, she lay low in the water, the sea washing across a ship that should have been finished. Captain Dudley Mason stayed with her. So did gunners and engineers who understood the arithmetic. Fuel into Malta equaled fighters into the air, equals convoys sunk on the enemy's routes. Destroyers came alongside in a dance at once daring and desperate. HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury took the tanker in tow, later joined and assisted by others, including the destroyer Bramham and the minesweeper Rye. Tow lines snapped under the jolts of bombs and the weight of a dying ship. More were passed and made fast. For a time, Ohio moved lashed between two destroyers, held in place by their steel, their momentum, and their will. When her steering locked, they steered for her. When her engines died, they dragged her. The air attacks did not stop. Bombs fell close enough to lift the trio out of the water. A near miss opened seams anew. For hours, the sea itself seemed intent on taking back what the convoy was trying to save. Each mile earned was fought for twice, once against the enemy, and again against the physics of a broken hull. Elsewhere in the strait and beyond, other freighters fought their own way in. Rochester Castle, Port Chalmers, Melbourne Star, Brisbane Star, battered, scorched but afloat, ran for Malta as escorts flung up walls of flak. Some made straight for Grand Harbour. One came in by a longer arc after damage and evasion. When a ship cleared the last headland, the people of Valletta gathered to watch, to count, and to cheer through tears. Every mast on the skyline was a reprieve measured in tons. Still, the Ohio was not there yet. The island's fighters, given a little fuel and a window, ranged out to cover the last miles. Minesweepers cleared the approaches. The destroyers heaved at their tow lines. On her buckled deck, men held to rails and to purpose. Everyone knew the date. It was mid-August. On Malta, that day had a name, the Feast of the Assumption. Before the island could celebrate, the ship had to live a little longer. August 15th, 1942, the battered procession entered Grand Harbour. Rochester Castle, Port Chalmers, Melbourne Star, and Brisbane Star had fought through on the 13th and 14th, each carrying precious cargo, flour, ammunition, spares, and much else besides. Now, with the harbour on edge and anti-aircraft guns still manned, the Ohio came in, sagging, barely above the surface, her decks awash, held upright by destroyers lashed to her either side. As the trio passed the great stone of the bastions, sirens and church bells answered them. The people on the heights called it the Santa Maria Convoy. Lines were made fast, pumps and hoses snaked aboard. Ohio's aviation fuel was transferred as quickly as men and machines could make it flow, even as her back gave way and she settled to the harbour bottom. She had done the one thing asked of her. She had brought Malta the spirit to fly and fight. In the days that followed, the numbers began to tell their own story. The convoy had sailed with 14 merchantmen. 5 reached Malta. The escorts had paid heavily. The carrier Eagle lost. The cruisers Cairo and Manchester sunk. The destroyer Foresight scuttled. Other major ships, Indomitable, Nigeria, Kenya, badly damaged. Dozens of smaller craft and many aircraft were gone. Axis losses in aircraft and submarines were substantial, but the tactical ledger could not disguise the sight of the harbour, cargo being unloaded, fuel being pumped. For Malta, the effect was immediate. Fighters flew again with regularity. Strike aircraft and submarines returned to the work that had made the central Mediterranean so costly for Axis shipping. Convoys bound for Rommel now faced an enemy revived at the very point they had hoped to silence. In the months that followed, as the battle in Egypt reached its climax, the sea war bent the same way. Fewer Axis supplies reached North Africa. Fewer tanks and guns reached the front in time. Captain Dudley Mason of the Ohio was awarded the George Cross. Many others received decorations for acts that often had no witness but the sea. On the quays and in the streets, the island's George Cross, awarded earlier that year to the people of Malta as a whole, found its echo in this arrival. A place that had endured now had more to endure with. Beyond the strategic maps and casualty figures, Operation Pedestal was a profoundly human drama. For the thousands of sailors, airmen, and merchant mariners involved, the battle was not an abstract concept but a terrifying reality. Below decks, stokers toiled in unimaginable heat, keeping engines running even as their ships shuddered under impacts. On bridges, officers made split-second decisions that meant life or death for hundreds. In gun tubs, young men stood their ground against waves of incoming aircraft, their faces grimed with cordite and sweat. The conditions on merchant ships were particularly harrowing. Unlike their naval escorts, these vessels were not designed for combat. Their crews, though augmented by Royal Navy gunners, were civilians whose primary duty was to deliver cargo, yet they faced the same dangers. When a merchantman was hit, survival was often slim. The Weimarama's catastrophic explosion, the rapid sinking of other ships, these were not just losses of tonnage, but the obliteration of entire crews. The plight of survivors was another testament to human cost. Men plunged into burning oil slicks, struggling through debris-choked water, often wounded, waiting for rescue. The destroyers, despite constant threat of further attack, performed heroic rescues, their crews extending ropes and nets to pull exhausted, oil-soaked men from the sea. These acts of selfless courage, often unrecorded in official histories, were commonplace. On Malta itself, the civilian population endured a different kind of heroism. For years they had lived underground, their lives punctuated by air raid sirens and bomb thunder. By August 1942, their resilience was stretched to breaking point. Food was so scarce they were eating anything they could find. The psychological toll of constant bombardment and creeping starvation was immense. Yet their morale, though battered, never fully broke. They watched the skies, prayed for the convoy, and when the first ships limped into Grand Harbour, their cheers were not just for supplies, but for the reaffirmation that they had not been forgotten. Among the unsung heroes were maintenance crews and damage control parties on warships. On HMS Indomitable, after devastating bomb hits crippled her flight deck, engineers and sailors worked furiously, often under fire, to contain fires and shore up structural damage. Their efforts saved the carrier. These men, far from the glamour of aerial combat or naval gunnery, performed the gritty, dangerous work that kept ships afloat and fighting. The scale of the operation meant that many individual acts of heroism occurred across the vast battlefield. From the Royal Navy gunner who stayed at his post on a sinking merchantman to the Maltese civilian who risked his life to help unload vital supplies, Pedestal was a mosaic of individual courage. These were not just statistics of war, they were lives lived and lost, hopes raised and dashed, all bound together by the desperate shared purpose of keeping Malta alive. The echoes of the Santa Maria Convoy reverberated across the Mediterranean, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape. The arrival of 5 merchant ships, and particularly the Ohio's vital cargo of aviation fuel, was a turning point for Malta. Within days, the island's airfields buzzed with renewed activity. Spitfires, fueled and rearmed, took to the skies in greater numbers. British submarines and torpedo bombers resumed their relentless interdiction of Axis supply convoys to North Africa. The impact on Rommel's Africa Corps was immediate and profound. Already struggling with overextended supply lines and chronic shortages of fuel and equipment, the renewed onslaught from Malta further choked his lifeline. The percentage of Axis shipping sunk or damaged by Allied forces operating from Malta rose sharply in the months following Pedestal. Rommel's operational capabilities were severely hampered, contributing directly to his inability to sustain his offensive at El Alamein in October 1942. The success of Pedestal did not win the war in the Mediterranean outright, but it undeniably provided the critical impetus for Allied victory in North Africa. Malta's survival meant that Rommel remained caught between the advancing Eighth Army from the east and constant attrition of his supplies from the north. This strategic pincer movement was instrumental in the Axis defeat in North Africa, which in turn paved the way for Allied invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy. Beyond immediate strategic implications, Operation Pedestal offered tactical and operational lessons for both sides. For the Allies, the heavy losses sustained by the convoy, particularly Eagle and Indomitable, highlighted the critical need for continuous, robust air cover. The rapid sinking of Eagle underscored the extreme vulnerability of aircraft carriers to submarine attack. The superhuman efforts to keep Ohio afloat became a testament to the effectiveness of damage control and the sheer resilience of naval and merchant crews. For the Axis, despite inflicting heavy losses, they failed to completely stop the convoy. This demonstrated Allied unwavering determination to hold Malta, forcing Axis commanders to acknowledge the immense resources the British were willing to commit. While Axis air power inflicted significant damage, it failed to destroy the entire convoy, highlighting the difficulty of sinking well-defended, resilient ships from the air. The enduring legacy of Pedestal for the Maltese people is perhaps the most profound. The Santa Maria Convoy became more than just a historical event. It became a defining moment of their national identity. It was a symbol of their resilience, their suffering, and their ultimate triumph. To this day, the convoy's arrival is commemorated, a powerful reminder of a time when their very existence hung by a thread, and a few brave ships answered their desperate call. Operation Pedestal became many things at once: a naval battle, an air battle, a campaign of convoys and cables, and a reminder that strategy, for all its arrows on maps, ends at the pier. It showed that a fortress island could be kept alive if a fleet was willing to pay the price. It showed that a tanker, torn in two, could still change a war's rhythm. What followed is part of the same line. With Malta resupplied, the interdiction of Axis shipping intensified. Over the late summer and autumn of 1942, more cargoes bound for North Africa were sunk or turned back. When the battle lines met again at El Alamein in October and November, logistics stood in the shadows behind every barrage, the petrol in one army's tanks and the lack of it in the others. Malta did not decide the battle by itself, but it helped decide what reached it. Pedestal also wrote a ledger of cost. 5 merchant ships arrived, 9 were lost. The escort lost a carrier, 2 cruisers, and a destroyer. Others were damaged and withdrawn. Hundreds of sailors and airmen did not return. The convoy delivered a little over 30,000 tons of supplies and, most critically, the aviation fuel, without which Malta's resurgence would have been impossible. Those numbers are not just statistics, they are the arithmetic of endurance. For the people of Malta, the memory has another name. The Santa Maria Convoy is remembered as an answer arrived on a particular day, not as a line item in a staff study. It is the sight of ships emerging from smoke and spray, the sound of bells ringing after years of air raid sirens, and the knowledge that the island would not go dark. In harbours and homes long after the war, the name Ohio could still quiet a room. Pedestal's lesson is simple and unforgiving. A port is not useful because you hold it, it is useful because ships can reach it. A plan is not complete when written, it is complete when cargo is unloaded and a machine restarts. The convoy was not a clean victory, nor was it a failure masked by rhetoric. It was a necessity carried out under fire. When later convoys came and the island's stocks rose, the urgency of that August faded into history's larger narrative. But the shape of the campaign in the Mediterranean holds the outline of Operation Pedestal plainly. An island at the centre, almost empty, a convoy sent with everything the Navy could spare, a week of attacks from above, below, and across the water, a tanker that would not die, a harbour that woke. In the end, Pedestal is remembered not because it was perfect, but because it was enough to keep Malta in the fight, enough to let the airfields and submarine pens do their work, enough to remind anyone who studies that war that sometimes the answer to a large question is a narrow passage and the ships that make it through. The sea closed over the wrecks and the oil slicks. Malta's cranes turned again, and with each net lifted, the war in the Mediterranean shifted a little more. The convoy had arrived, the island endured, and from that endurance flowed consequences far beyond the horizon.